So, pretty dramatic day then at the Commission of Inquiry there. It's adjourned, and we may yet see former President Zuma at a future date appearing before that inquiry. He says that he will cooperate. Let's get a bit of analysis now on this state capture inquiry from one of our regular analysts, Angelo Fick. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon, Peter.
All right, so it's been a dramatic week. I think a lot of people were surprised that former President Zuma would be at the Commission so soon. One had thought that we'd hear a lot more and then he'd come later, might even have to be subpoenaed. But he accepted an invitation to come before the inquiry, and it seems that what he thought was an invitation and how it was going to go was at odds with what the Commission legal team had. And this really is where it started to fall apart.
Yes, and I think that one doesn't want to call it a lecture, but the outline before the recess this morning that the Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo gave on how exactly it got to this point, how an invitation was issued, why, under what circumstances, and which rules would apply, I think was a very important aspect to remind all of us and Mr. Zuma and his legal team and the Commission legal team that this is about the process as founded in law, policy and its implementation. It isn't about rhetoric, and despite what we are now calling drama, it actually isn't about performance and perception. It is about whether or not rules are being followed. And I think that outline for me was, shall we say, a reminder that this is a process that, while one may have certain emotional responses to it and feelings about it, is a process founded in law, and as a result of having been founded in law, must play itself out according to the rules set within that law. And that, I think, has been a major contention throughout the week. Let's not forget that Mr. Zuma's legal representatives started rising on the very first day, asking about the legitimacy of the Commission, questioning the process, questioning the point at which they were being driven, and the breakdown and the statement on two occasions this week that they would, on Monday we were told that they had disengaged in all sorts of ways, and today that they were no longer participating, I think opened the door to the Deputy Chief Justice having to remind us what this process is actually supposed to achieve.
All right, so then they went into chambers. Before they went to chambers, they seemed to be poles apart. The legal team of the Commission, led by Advocate Pretorius, basically saying, listen, we're going to stick by the rules. We're not going to make things easier for anybody. We're just going to be fair based on the rules. And the other party saying, look, you're treating him as an accused, etc., etc. And then they came back, and it seems that they found common ground. Somebody had to have climbed down or given some concession. What do you think might have happened behind closed doors?
I don't know what happened behind those closed doors, but from the statements that I'm hearing from the Deputy Chief Justice, my sense is that they were all being read the Riot Act in private, in very much the way in which he had done so, but possibly stronger, because in the end he reminded us, I am the one who takes responsibility, I make decisions, I am in control of this process. And in that moment he reminded me of a different former Deputy Chief Justice, former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, at the Life Esedimeni process, and also during one of the processes in the Constitutional Court, where the Deputy Chief Justice then and Raymond Zondo today had to remind people that this is not just a space in which people perform and for public consumption to understand what is going on, that there are legal principles at play, and that he is the adjudicator of whether or not rules are being followed, and that he had indicated as on the various days where he felt that the legal process needed to be stuck to. And so I think, again, while we watch this on television, and it may come across as yet another kind of dramatic crime drama television fictional process, there are actually principles of law very important to maintain for a rule-governed state that we say we want to return to as South Africans, that we must remember have to be adhered to. And so I think the Deputy Chief Justice very patiently explained for a very long time how that process works, and I suspect what we see coming out of that recess over the lunch period was a reminder in perhaps stronger terms of who is in control of this commission and what the consequences would be for behaving in particular ways.
All right, a number of things happened, but just before we leave the inquiry and then go to his address in the park, looking back at the week, looking back at his appearance and then pulling out, and looking back at the statements made by both sides of the legal teams, what would you say has been the political fallout, the reputational damage, if any? What have been the consequences both for the Commission and for former President Zuma, if anything?
So let's begin with the Commission. So there was certainly, in my understanding of what was being said by Mr. Zuma's legal representatives, an attempt to indicate that the Commission was operating in a way that was detrimental to their client. The Deputy Chief Justice repeated and reiterated that that was not what the process was about. The process was not about him. The process was about fact-finding and inquiry. I think that some of the actions in the court, in the process, brought into the court of public analysis the African National Congress itself. For a former president of the organization to make the kinds of statements that Mr. Zuma was making, and to make the kinds of allegations against individuals that he had appointed to his cabinet who held positions of leadership in his party, and to say that he knew things about them for 30 years and chose not to reveal them, really is an issue that the African National Congress is going to have to struggle with in perpetuity. It's not going to go away over the next 6 weeks or 5 weeks, and so there's that element. Then there is the perception that was created about Mr. Zuma himself in his conduct, and that's something that I think is going to play itself out over the next few years. We are not in a process where he's sitting in court and answering questions that have him as the accused. We're in a process where he's being asked questions of clarification, questions, the answers to which he can provide in order to say that these people who say the things they say are wrong, and this is how they're wrong. And his behavior, amiable on occasion, is contrasted for me very interestingly with the behavior of his lawyers, who at no point strike me as amiable. They seem to be combative, they seem to be agitated, and so the question that one has here is their continued, there's no polite way of putting it, but interrogation of the purpose and the behavior of the Commission is, I think, going to create the impression, is already creating the impression, that there is an oddity, there is an being at odds with between the former president and his legal team and the Commission. When he says things outside about how this Commission was established, repeating what he had said on Monday under oath into the microphone for the entire world to hear, what we're beginning to see is a man who has a particular understanding of the world that we must also begin to interrogate.
All right, okay, so from a former president to a current president and the public protector, and this seems to be something that's been moving quite a bit, different issues, first with some of his ministers and senior officials, Pravin Gordhan, one of them, and now directly at his own doorstep, he's been found to have misled Parliament. Take us through what this judgment might mean for President Ramaphosa.
So the findings of the public protector now require actions by not just Parliament, not just the new head of the National Directorate of Public Prosecutions, not just by Mr. Ramaphosa himself, but by the police. So there are various remedial actions that have been recommended. Mr. Ramaphosa, of course, has the right to take all of this on judicial review and will probably do so quite urgently, given the time frames that have been placed in there. So my sense is that we have to wait to hear from the presidency and from Mr. Ramaphosa himself what will happen next. I am in some agreement with Mr. Musi Maimane, who indicates that this opens up a slight can of worms, because this means that all sorts of other people who were at the time sitting in Parliament and had access to funds must now reveal where those funds came from. I think that this is both a positive and a negative step in some respects, because that means what goes for one set of chickens must go for, mixed metaphor, another set of geese and ducks. All politicians who now receive money may have to reveal in all sorts of ways what they do with that money. And I disagree with him slightly when he says it might be difficult to get people who were in Parliament then but not in Parliament now. These things do not have to end. There's no moratorium on them, because once you were in office, let's not forget that the public protector found against somebody who was not in Parliament anymore, but said that he had misled Parliament when he was in Parliament at the time. So those kinds of implications, I think, cut across party lines.
Is this enough for the President to even lose his job over?
That is a decision that the party, the African National Congress, would have to take. it would have to take a decision. Also, this depends on how Parliament responds, and whether or not individual members of Parliament find Parliament's response unacceptable should they choose not to pursue that route, and then take this matter to court, and then all the way back to the Constitutional Court. We've been here before. Let's not forget that the motions of no confidence, the secret ballot judgments in the Constitutional Court, there are legal processes. But before we get there, the onus is on President Cyril Ramaphosa to decide whether or not to institute a legal challenge to these findings, because if he does not, then he has to do certain things. And if he chooses not to, those certain things have to be done. And this is, again, not about public opinion. How you and I feel is important in a democracy, but the rule of law, the letter of the law, the spirit in which the law is interpreted, that is what now has to follow next. And that can be a very complicated process, because the public protector has been very specific in which remedies she is suggesting, the time frames for those remedies, and which of the various state organs and institutions have to be involved.
So what about Advocate Busisiwe Mkhobane's own future? Because a parliamentary committee is going to have to sit and discuss her future. And I wonder, will there be an appetite under this current environment to want to deal with that question, or do they wait until the dust has settled? What does Parliament do?
So my understanding would be that if Parliament wishes to act against the sitting public protector, they would have to have sufficient evidence. And that would be either a series of court judgments in which the public protector's competence becomes a matter of question, and that would have to be argued. Also, let's not forget that there is a very complex set of relationships between the executive arm, the legislative arm, the judicial arm, and the Chapter 9 organizations. And so Advocate Mkhobane, who, let's not forget, some of her closest, shall we say, supporters in this moment were some of her most vociferous critics in a previous moment. And so the changing dynamic and the changing alliances in South African politics must also be borne in mind. This reduction of our politicians and of our public figures to heroes and villains is serving us very, very poorly. I did indicate 18 months ago that if we're going to change South Africa from where it was to where we want it to be, a rule-bound state where everybody is responsible and behaves inside the law, it is not going to be a 5-month fight. Removing individuals from positions of power will not do it. The entire way in which, as all 58 million of us approach the state, approach government, approach its arms, understand the role of and functions of individuals, and how they are, to quote Chief Justice Mogoeng, constituted by the Constitution, and how in their conduct they must obey the Constitution. And that approach, I think, is very different from what in public domain one often sees, which is about personalities, whether they're likable or not, and whether we're supposed to be loyal to them or not.
All right, we've run out of time, but very briefly, next week, EFF versus SACP, Kathrado Foundation, with Advocate Busisiwe Mkhobane. There's quite a lot that's now playing out, and I just wonder if you can make sense of it all for us. And once this battle is finished, does the EFF go back to saying we don't want Busisiwe Mkhobane? We support the position of the public protector, but we don't want Busisiwe Mkhobane, because that's what they'd been saying for some time.
Well, that's going to be a test for them. And, you know, your first question to me is, can I help you make sense of all of it? I think we're all in the process of minute by minute, day by day, trying to make sense of the political dynamic in South Africa, because it shifts so often. It is about relations of convenience. It is about what works. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The friend of my enemy is my enemy. And these kinds of relations, while they make for interesting dinner time conversations, actually are not how a rule-bound, constitutionally ordered state works. And so much of the rhetoric that our politicians make in public is to sway the public in all sorts of ways, and they have every right to do so. But the public must remind themselves that there is a spirit and letter of the law by which all of us have to act, and that is eventually where right and wrong will be decided.
All right, Chris. Angelo, sorry, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for your insights.
Thank you so much, Peter.